everyone, welcome to the latest episode of the SaaS Sessions podcast. Today we have Lucas Lovell on the show with us, joining in from London. Lucas is currently the VP of Product at Paddle. It's a payments infrastructure company for digital software businesses. And prior to that, prior to Paddle, Lucas was the founder of an early stage startup in a travel and hospitality space that he built and launched in Australia right out of law school. So, hey Lucas, such a pleasure to have you on the show.
Hey, Sunil, great to be here. Thanks very much for the introduction and looking forward to talking to you today.
Awesome. Great. So, Lucas, you coming from Australia, right? Like I know I gave a very short introduction. It's not like a very hot spot for tech or SaaS companies. Like the only like the biggest SaaS company or even tech company that I've seen come out of Australia is Atlassian. So again, like how it was for you building a company in Australia and then moving a shift to SaaS or tech rather, and then shifting to UK. So maybe you can talk more about yourself
Yeah.
and how was your journey been in the SaaS ecosystem?
Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned, I launched my company in Australia straight out of law school. Didn't really fancy working as a lawyer or in the legal field, so moved into tech by launching my own company. As you mentioned, Australia is a pretty good market for tech companies. We have some pretty big success stories. You pointed out Atlassian being one of the big sort of SaaS success stories coming out of Australia, probably the largest one. The other one that pops to mind is Canva, which is also a very successful software company that
That's
is
correct.
Australian founded.
Mm.
So there are some really, really good stories. And I think the tech ecosystem in Australia has come a long way in the last
Mm.
10 to 20 years. And there was nothing particularly wrong or that I guess about the tech ecosystem for myself and my co-founders. It was more about market opportunity for us. So
Mm.
we worked in travel and tourism and we got a really good opportunity to move our company to France actually and build the
Oh,
business
nice.
in Paris, which presented a bunch of challenges. But primarily the opportunity for us was about market size and it was a little bit serendipitous. It wasn't something that we sought. We didn't sit down in a room one day and say to ourselves, let's move our company overseas. We were pretty comfortable with where we were in Australia, but the
Mm.
opportunity presented itself. It was a really interesting one. As a tourism and hospitality company, a SaaS platform that sold to tourism and hospitality companies, the idea of moving from Australia, which is, a relatively small market, not a tiny market, but a relatively
Mm.
small market compared to having access to the entire European market through the conduit of being located in Paris, which is, top two or three most visited cities in the world with an incredible sort of tourism infrastructure behind it. It made a lot of sense
Mm.
from a sort of commercial and market opportunity perspective, but also from a personal perspective. We were pretty keen to go out and see the world and
Mm.
explore new places. And so the opportunity ultimately was attractive from a number of dimensions, but it wasn't sort of anything to do with the Australian tech ecosystem or us being dissatisfied with the Australian tech ecosystem that sort of drove
Mm.
us to go and grow the company in France.
That's really interesting. And to your point, as you mentioned, right? Like I totally forgot about Canva. I mean, that's one tool I like use every day, and I don't know like how I forgot it. But again, like great stories, and I'm sure that moving from Australia to again like a country like France, and in that also like a city like Paris, as you mentioned, just been like visited, like top two or three cities in the world, which is like most
Mhm.
visited, and I'm sure like just being there, even though you moved there for your travel and hospitality startup, right? I'm sure you must have been exposed a lot to the tech and SaaS ecosystem, which
Mhm.
you are part of now, right? I know like so many amazing again SaaS companies that have come out of Paris as well. I think
Yep.
Spendesk being one of them, Algolia, if I'm not wrong,
Yep.
being one of them as well. So again, like great
Correct.
companies, right? And so like in your role, right, as when you're leading product and all things product
Mhm.
at Paddle, right? So and especially like you yourself have been into a position where you have moved countries and let alone continents, different cities, and just to explore how can you expand the market, right? So how like what was the reason behind choosing France, right, and not choosing something else, right, like or choosing Paris in France as well? Again, as you
Sure.
mentioned, like maybe like most visited city in the world and having a great travel infrastructure, maybe digitized Like everybody has phones, access to internet, all of that, right? So I'm sure you must have, have a checklist that you ticked like, hey, does this city or does this place meet all the, items there,
Yep.
right? So maybe you can share how are you identifying and prioritizing the international markets for expansion, and what are some of those items in your checklist?
For sure, for sure. I think for us, to be very honest with you, it wasn't something that we actively chose through a short list of sorts. We didn't sort of buy a
Hmm.
list of 10 potential places to go and build a company and land on Paris. Ultimately, we shifted there because we had a great opportunity that involved money and some investment in the company from that was the key driver. So there was an access to capital component to it, which was the initial catalyst for us to move over there. But at the same time, there are definitely places we would have gone. It was a little bit of an alignment of many things for us as a tourism and hospitality company. But the main catalyst for us at the time was access to capital in France. But
Hmm.
I think to answer your question, Paris and France was really good from a market size perspective. I think there are a couple of lenses through which you can think about sort of identifying and prioritizing international markets. One is the business lens, which is like, can I build a successful company there? And I think there are a number of components to that. And the other one is the operational lens. Like, what are the
Hmm.
barriers to entry in terms of building a company in France? And arguably, France has a reputation for having quite a few barriers to entry. It's not known necessarily as a place that is easy to do
Hmm.
business. I think the UK, for example, is much more known as a place that's easy to do business. But
Hmm.
nonetheless, you can't get everything right. And we were moving to France at a time when a lot was changing. This was 8 years ago now, when a lot was changing around the ease of doing business, and also there was a big effort to sort of internationalize the tech ecosystem by
Hmm.
encouraging international founders to Paris. But just focusing on the business side of the equation, for us, it was, to your point, market size. France is a large country. It has a large tourism market, and it gives you access to the entire European market as well, which is one of the biggest markets in the world. And I think that's a really important consideration. I
Hmm.
think there are some things we definitely got wrong around sort of launching in a new country as well, especially on the distribution side. So how we can take that, how we took our product to market. But I think considering things like market size, product market fit, the competitive landscape in the country, and also to your point, the macroeconomic trends. So where is the data pointing in terms of the macro? Things like e-commerce trends, how people are adopting technology, in what direction is the particular market trending. So on the business side, I think there's some of the key components to it. And on the operational side, I think understanding the legal and regulatory environment is really
Yeah.
important, because that differs between countries for sure. Thinking deeply about localization and customer support. Does it
Hmm.
require you to provide your offering in another language, for example? And localization extends not just from languages, but also to things like
Yeah.
currency and payment processing. And then sort of broadly supporting the infrastructure required to do all of that. And then, of course, I think there's a cost of doing business
Hmm.
perspective as well. Cost of labor, cost of setting up a company, cost
Hmm.
of maintaining and running a company, that are really important considerations as well. Now, that's assuming that you want to sort of set up locally in a particular country or market. We often talk about in tech and in SaaS that, SaaS is global from day one, and we all aspire to be global from day one. And that is, of course, true. But the thing that I would probably say is, I think whilst it's very possible and feasible and common in SaaS and tech to be global from day one, I don't necessarily think that always translates to being successful globally from day one. And I think a lot of companies perhaps tend to underestimate the effort required to localize their offering and succeed in different markets across a number of different components.
Hmm.
So I think that's a really important consideration.
Totally. Again, like really good way to break it down into like what lens you can look at when you're, expanding to different markets, right? And as you said, correctly pointed that I think not all products are global from day one, right? Like if you're a company like Deal, right? Or
Mhm.
remote.com, or something like that, like you can't off like your services globally, right? Like you have to set up entities, you have to go
Of
to the
course.
local place, do the compliances, regulation, and all of that. So even for a company like Stripe, and I'm sure like for Paddle as well, right?
Yep.
Like you have to come to that market, get the financial institutions with your side, and like understand like how the local fintech ecosystem is, and get integrated, get in deep in the roots, and I'm sure that that must have been a very crucial deciding factor as to like, hey, should we expand to this country or not, right? Obviously,
Mhm.
people can sign up from India or from Philippines or from wherever, right? But like signing up doesn't necessarily mean that they get value out of your product, right? Which you want to provide to everybody, right? So that's a
Correct.
good aspect, and good segue into what I wanted to ask you next. So, in terms of when you mention what is the importance of understanding like local laws, and oftentimes you're blindsided by the amount of things that you have to go through just to set up operations there. So, how
Mhm.
do you solve it at Paddle, right? Maybe you can share some story, some experience that you had with Paddle where you were expanding to a new market, and maybe that there
Mhm.
were some challenges that you ran into even after like researching like probably for like 6 months or whatever, right? Like still you run into challenges.
Yeah, I think from the Paddle perspective, it's interesting. So Paddle is a, as you mentioned at the outset, Paddle is a payments infrastructure platform for software companies, end-to-end billing and payments.
Mm,
We operate under what we call a merchant of record model,
mm,
which means technically we're a reseller. And what we do is we take away a lot of the operational challenges that companies typically encounter when they have to expand internationally. So a lot of the compliance with local sales tax, for example, the collection and remittance and filing of sales tax is something that we handle for our customers, as well as providing a suite of tools that enable our customers to localize their pricing, offer sort of local payment methods, sell their products in local currency all over the world. So
mm,
a lot of companies come to Paddle because they want to take away to take on some of that burden of operating
mm,
internationally, so that they can focus on their product. And that's primarily the value proposition of Paddle, right? At its very core, when you go and move into a new country, you're liable for sales tax in that country, so you need to have the mechanism to calculate the right tax rate, file your tax filings, collect the right sales tax, remit that to the relevant authority, and Paddle does all of that for you. So I think for us, we help and we serve a lot of companies who are trying to expand internationally and go global. And we very much sort of consider ourselves a company that can help companies be successful globally from day one, and not just sort of support customer acquisition globally. And I think the one thing we talk about a lot at Paddle is sort of how you can use your payments platform as a growth lever. I think a lot of
mm,
people perceive their payments platform as an operational partner, which is very much true. We exist to capture your revenue and to sort of enable you to sell your product in country X or country Y in the right currency and the right payment method. But also, how can we help our customers adjust their pricing based on willingness to pay? Right? Because there's
yeah.
different levels of willingness to pay across the world. How can we deploy local payment methods? Like, how can we make sure that you're deploying Alipay
Mm,
in China, and that you're deploying the right payment method here and there, and that you're selling in the right currency and localizing your checkout experience and buying experience
mm,
so that it's native and familiar to your buyers in any region. So for us, we aim to take all of that sort of complexity away from a company that is trying to scale internationally, and we focus very deeply on sort of SaaS and subscription businesses.
mm,
Um, I think though the thing to remember from our perspective is that we are doing it all for our customers. So we are sort of going through the pain of doing that international expansion and setting ourselves up locally
mm,
so our customers don't have to. So we have sort of a global network of entity structures that enable us to access local acquiring, right, from a payments
mm,
perspective, which enables us to drive payment performance. So, and then of course the treasury networks associated with having bank accounts and being able to accept money in different currencies, all of that is baked into the Paddle offering. So for us, like, being international or going global is very much in our DNA, and it's something that we really strive to support our customers with.
No, that's really great. And one important and very interesting point that you mentioned, right? Like how people or how you can offer like payments infrastructure as a growth lever to companies, right? Like I think that's that's really a very interesting point that a lot of companies might think it's not, but in reality it is like a big factor, right? Like I was just thinking when you mentioned that, and I have myself run into so many challenges, right? As simple as I like to use Amex a lot, but
Mhm.
then Amex has very tiny acceptance rate in India, right? So if I go and try to buy anything online, many places where I cannot use Amex, where I want to shop.
Yeah,
So I do have a backup card, but then obviously I want to use Amex for whatever reason. So, like just having that infrastructure where, you can take Amex cards, or maybe I like, Apple Pay, right? Obviously Apple Pay doesn't work in India, but maybe I like it and it is there. And if it's not like available as an option to pay, right? It's just like
yeah.
hassle for me to go and add my credit card details every time, and it's just like a friction point. And I think that's where a lot of e-commerce, or not only e-commerce but a lot of companies, even SaaS, where you can just put in your credit card and start using. I think they would lose the interest of people, right? Right at when they're trying to make the payment, which is the worst way to lose somebody, because they've already convinced they are ready to buy,
Totally.
but they cannot because of whatever reason. So I think, and if you just, it's a very small hurdle to unlock, and but once you unlock it, it kind of like, shoots a revenue by a lot, right? And that's very interesting point.
And the uplift is really meaningful, right?
Yeah.
So we can see some data that shows us that companies that are deploying Alipay in China can see like 5 to 6x
Oh,
the
nice.
volume come through the
Hmm.
Chinese market. Because to your point, when buyers are going through the checkout experience and they're getting to the
Hmm.
payment page, they're not seeing their payment method of choice, and that's causing them to drop out of the flow, right? So as you said, it's a really unfortunate way to lose a customer, right? It's a really
Yeah.
unfortunate way to lose a customer because they
Yeah.
want your product, they're committed to buying your product, their intention to purchase is high, and all you've done is not provided the right payment method so that they can't ultimately hit that button and purchase your thing.
Hmm.
And I think like that's true. I think for me, right, and something that we see a lot in countries like the UK and Europe and the US and Australia, which are very much dominated by credit cards, is this assumption that if you have a credit card, sorry, if you offer credit cards as a payment option, which everyone does in e-commerce, right? Then you've got the whole global market covered. And it's really not true. There are lots of emerging economies and other regions that have a very high adoption of local payment methods. China's a
Hmm.
great example where Alipay, WeChat Pay are very, very dominant payment methods, but there are others. You might have heard of Pix in Brazil. So Brazil
Yeah.
payment method called Pix, which has higher adoption than cards. So
Hmm.
more payments are being processed through Pix than are being processed through Visa and Mastercard's rails. So
Hmm.
it's easy to sit here in the UK and go, everyone accepts credit cards when they actually don't, right?
Hmm.
So it's a really important thing to consider
Yeah.
when you're going global for sure.
Totally. I think in India, as you mentioned, like for China and Brazil, like I think in India, like AI is
Correct.
like a very local method of payment. Like you can make transactions worth of thousands of dollars, and even like 10 cents with the UPI, right? And it's just very seamless, right? It's just on your phone. It's just like everywhere. So I would really, not, if I like wanting to purchase, and I want to do it via UPI. Like sometimes I do for convenience, and if I don't have that, if they don't have an option to pay with UPI, like obviously like it's very unheard of now. But if there is a website and which doesn't offer like UPI payments, then obviously like I would be like, I don't want to complete this transaction, and they would lose a customer, right?
Yeah.
So again, I like very, very small, hurdle to cross. And obviously companies can use paddle to, cross that hurdle, right? And not only one country, but like pretty much everywhere. But like I think the outcome is exponential. So very, very interesting. So taking it a little like further ahead, right? Of, as you mentioned, like, Alipay in China, UPI in India, there's Plix in Brazil and or Latin
Mhm.
America, something like that, right? So what are some of your insights on building these partnerships when you yourself at Paddle are going and partnering up with different countries, right? So
Yeah.
how can startups who are also, maybe they're a platform like Paddle, or maybe they're just like a business, right? But when they're trying to expand into new markets, so how can they leverage these local partnerships to, just solve for distribution that will in turn help create some good GTM plans for them, where
Yeah.
they can, expand through these partners, or just be available, or even learn from these partners, get familiar with the region, which will solve for both like acquisition and for retention for
Yeah.
these customers. So what's your like thoughts on that? Like how can companies solve for this?
Yeah, for sure. I think if we're talking purely from a payments perspective,
Hmm.
you need to find a payments platform or a payments
Yeah,
partner that
like
best
paddle.
meets.
Like
right?
paddle.
Well, like Paddle, and there are lots of other payments companies out there
Yeah.
that can support your global ambition in different ways, and different payments companies different regions in different ways, and different payments companies
Mm,
have different performance across the world based on where they're putting their efforts. So I think really thinking deeply about, and whether it's Paddle or not, right, but really thinking deeply about if we're talking purely about payments, who is your partner that is best suited to sort of your go-to-market strategy and for your market expansion plans is a really crucial part. You want to make sure that you're not leaving money in the table through the examples that we spoke about before by not offering a local payment method in China. If China is your strategy, you need to make sure you have a payments platform or a payments partner that can
mm,
support your market expansion plans. I think that's critical as a starting point. If we're
mm,
talking more broadly about sort of go to market and how you can do it, I think then your distribution and your channel strategy are critical. I think that the first question to potentially ask is, are you going to undertake direct sales? Are you going to uniquely provide a PLG motion in a particular market or region? Or are you going to deploy a direct sales motion? So have a sales team selling directly into that region? Or are you going to
mm,
use channel partners? Are you going to use partnership networks with other tech companies, with other distribution channels to really boost your presence in that location? I think both of those things are entirely possible. I think launching a direct sales motion in a particular region can be challenging. I think the upfront cost might be higher. So we see lots of customers sort of successfully leveraging channel partners to support their growth in certain regions, at least to test the waters and to be a bit experimental from the outset,
mm.
understanding the market a little bit more, learning about the market, dipping your toes in a little bit to sort of test whether the proposition resonates. I think using a channel partnership approach is really good. I think ultimately having local partners is really good as well. That was something that we really lent on when we moved our company to Paris. We leveraged, if we're talking early stage companies, leveraging incubators and accelerators. And we went and we joined a couple of acceleration programs, which opened up our doors to some really powerful networks that
Mm,
enabled us to sell and became quite good distribution channels. And they also give you lots of market expertise and help you better understand the local ecosystem, which I think is critical to building out your offering in that particular region, understanding cultural norms, understanding business practices, understanding, what are the tweaks you need to make to your messaging and your positioning to be successful in that market. So I think really leveraging local partnerships, being intentional about your distribution channel. Are you going to take a direct sales route? Are you going to leverage channel partners? Are you going to start through a PLG motion that you can sort of manage from where you're currently located without having to build out the go-to-market infrastructure? I think are all really important things to think about.
nice, nice. Very. How would you mentioned like when you also moved to from Australia to France, like for your company, and you made use of these local accelerator programs and just being active in the ecosystem. But what are some of the tactical things like that? Because obviously it's a new country, right? Like for you,
Hmm.
maybe you know stuff, you don't know stuff, right? But for companies out there who are listening, right? Like for people out there who want to expand into like new geographies, right? Like Middle East,
Yep.
where you don't know, like, okay, how do I go? What are the accelerator programs?
Yep.
Like if you can share any like, tactical advice on like how to do that. I mean, like, okay, if you're already like an established company, let's say in any
Yep.
in India or let's say in the US and you want to expand into Middle East and get into an accelerator program, but there might be some hurdles there also, right? Like
Yep.
which you must have faced, and maybe there is an entry barrier, maybe they don't allow outside companies, maybe they don't allow companies who are already funded. Might be a
Hmm.
lot of entry barriers. So just want to understand like like what sort of um like things that you can share with somebody who's just like
Yep.
trying to expand into market so that they can like avoid learn something and maybe avoid some mistakes, like common
Yeah,
mistakes.
sure. Sure. I think one of the great things to do is to do a bit of a roadshow. Like
Mm,
get on a plane and go there and spend 3 or 4 weeks there. And spend
mm,
3 or 4 weeks there meeting people, going to events, jump on Meetup, find different tech events that are happening in that particular location. Aim to go to 3 or 4 of them a week. Stay there for
mm,
4 weeks. Talk to people, meet partners,
mm,
learn about the ecosystem. You'll end up pitching your business a lot. You'll end up testing whether your business is interesting to people there. You get a much better feel for the ecosystem and how it works and who the key
mm,
players are. And I think it's worth every dollar. I think
Mm.
I've seen companies do this really successfully, where they just send someone or a small team of people to a certain market for a defined period of time, getting their boots on the ground, getting in front of people, getting that face time with the key players to really test out whether it's an interesting opportunity for them. I think that's probably the main thing that I would do. Like if I was taking a new market really, really seriously, um, yeah, I think that's the most sort of tactical advice I could give. I think I'm a big believer in getting boots on the ground and really understanding the ins and outs of the market. Another one is potentially hiring people directly with market expertise. So,
Mm.
acknowledging that, you can't be an expert on everything, and you probably need someone who understands that market deeply, who can speak the language, who's worked in that market before, and use them as a conduit or a vehicle to sort of you launching in that particular market. And you could hire them locally where you are, or you could hire like a country manager of sorts, depending on
Mm.
sort of your maturity level and how fast the expansion strategy is evolving, I guess. But I think local talent is another really good way to sort of think about it as well.
Nice, nice. Very, very interesting. And just one last thing on the same topic before we move on to the lightning round, right? So how important it is where, when you're expanding into like a new geography, how important it is to think of the GTM from ground zero and, take a first principles approach into, let's say, marketing or even sales or
Yeah,
everything. You already have a playbook that is built, let's say for US, right? And you already have
yeah,
a playbook
yeah,
built for Europe, but now you're expanding into Middle East. So obviously it's not going to work, right? That's been said
yeah.
enough, right? On this show itself, it's been said like at least 5 times, if not
Sure.
more, by different people. So that's been established, right? But like, what are some of the things that you feel that, you can quickly, if not copy, but get inspiration from your existing playbooks and that could fast track your approach and entry into the new ecosystem or new market basically.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think you raise, I mean, this is probably the most difficult thing, right? It's how do you strike that balance between
Mm.
sort of global consistency and local flexibility, right?
Mm.
Where is the taking what's working already and deploying it in a new market is the most efficient route, right? But it
Mm.
may not be the most successful route. So it's this balance of like efficiency versus sort of customization, I guess.
Yeah.
Taking a one size fits all approach and building, a bespoke offering. And I think it's super important because there is I do believe that you have to try and somewhat scale some of your foundational infrastructure and playbooks that you've built, right? When you're thinking about sort of your product, your go-to-market approach, your operational, there is always going to be a foundational underlying thread of your playbook that I think needs to be somewhat consistent and can be consistent. But it's all about how you sort of manage that sort of global consistency of the playbook with the local flexibility and making sure that it succeeds locally. So I think in terms of like your go-to-market approach from entering into a new market, I think there are a number of different components. I think pricing and packaging is a really important one. Going back
Mm.
to first principles about pricing and packaging, your channel strategy, as we discussed before, making sure that you have a demand generation engine, and really just thinking about the general sort of mechanics of product market fit. Or do you have a local presence from a demand generation perspective? Are you launching marketing campaigns so that you can build the top of funnel in that particular market? And then making sure, of course, as a prerequisite to those things, that your value prop and your messaging is resonating with that audience, and making sure you're thinking about whether you have to localize your messaging, which in many cases is language, but it can also be tone and style. So I
Mm.
think there's a pretty simple sort of 4 or 5 point checklist around pricing, channel strategy, demand gen, value prop, and messaging. And then I think the other one is probably cultural norms and personas, which is a really, I think it's a piece that people often forget about. This is something that got us a lot in France. Like a good example is business formality is very different around the world. So we particularly noticed how much more formal business was done in Europe versus Australia. In Australia, business is very casual. You can
Mm.
call people mate, and people are like, yeah, of course I'm your mate. But in Europe, there's a lot more formality in how you do business. Um, Another good example is German people are very data conscious, something that
Mm.
we learned. That's great. They good on them. But when we were selling in Germany, we had to tweak our go-to-market approach to surface data concerns earlier on in the sales process to get ahead of the problem, because we found that there was a lot more sort of data consciousness in German people, which was interesting. So I think sort of pricing and packaging, channel strategies, thinking about demand gen, top of funnel, making sure your value prop resonates, and then really thinking about sort of cultural norms, personas, and principles to make you successful is a good checklist to be starting with.
Nice, very very interesting. And I think like like we all talk about like knowing your customer, and that is like the most important thing. I think this, like, just knowing your customer and just doing those first few iterations, as you said, right? Like
Yeah.
maybe when you started like selling in Germany, you didn't know that they were data conscious or data first and all of that. But after first few iterations, you understood and then reorganized again to solve that issue, right? So that's really important, where you constantly keep listening for feedback, right? And just look at signals, like what is happening, always like keep up to date on your customer information, right? Like how they react, what they say, what they don't say. And maybe each new person that you interact with, or each new business that you're trying to sell to in the new market, is sharing some new information, and that gets added to your knowledge base or whatever. So very very interesting points. Let's move on to the lightning round. I know I've asked you
Sure.
like a lot of questions already, and maybe like three more. And since given in the name, it's lightning round, so you have to like answer like whatever's on top of your mind. So
hmm
let's get started with the first one, right? So what's your one tip, Lucas, for managing work-life balance?
One tip for managing work-life balance. I think setting boundaries for yourself is
Hmm.
critical. And I think the best way that I've found to set boundaries for myself is actually how I manage notifications from workplace tools that I use. So I make sure that all of my Slack notifications get turned off after 6 p.m. because it reduces the temptation
Hmm.
to sort of check in on work. And I think that that boundary is really important to make sure that when I'm not at work, I'm focusing on other aspects of my life and not being distracted at work by work. Sorry, this is something I was never typically very good at. I used to be out with friends or out with my partner and checking my phone, and all that sort of stuff. But I think establishing those clearer boundaries and using notification settings on key workplace tooling is a really important piece and something that I've found to be very useful.
Nice, nice. That's a hack I personally use as well. So, like I,
Yeah.
I can attest to that it works, right? Just turning off notifications, it's a very good way. Because that's like the trigger, right? Which happens like, okay, now you have
Totally.
to check your phone, and once you check your phone, like you open Slack, and then it, that starts the spiral of like one thing leads to another, and then suddenly you're on a laptop like working. Never know.
Absolutely.
On to the next one, right? So what's the one thing that you wish, Lucas, you would have known when you first started?
Ooh. When I first started at Paddle or when I first started my career
I mean, in general. I mean,
in
like,
general? What's the one thing I wish I'd known when I'd first started? That's a difficult question.
maybe like if I have to like turn it in a way and ask differently, is like, what advice would you give to your past self, right?
Yeah.
Like, hey, like if you can travel back in time and tell yourself like, Lucas, don't do this
Yeah.
or do this.
Yeah.
That's like one way to look at it.
Yeah. I think the one thing I would go back and tell myself is that I think you best build knowledge through doing it. And I
Hmm.
think you should always think about the act of doing something or the act of using something is the best way to actually advance your knowledge of how
Hmm.
to do it successfully. I think it's wonderful to read books and to learn from people who've done it in the past, but the only way
Nice.
that you truly learn is by actually doing it yourself. And I think that applies to so many things. I've been telling my team a lot recently that like the best way to understand the impact of AI on technology and on how we work at Paddle is to go and use it yourself. If you want to think about adopting AI in product, right? Like my advice is go and use it yourself and understand its potential, understand its constraints and limitations. So I think
Hmm.
the best conduit to knowledge is acting and doing as opposed to reading and listening. Not to suggest reading isn't important, but doing is more
Yeah.
powerful.
No, totally. And the third question relates to reading particularly, but just before we get on to that, Like I just realized we spent 40 minutes and we didn't like this was the first time we mentioned AI as a keyword because it's really hard to not
We should be
mention
proud
it.
of that.
Yeah, we should be proud of that. That's why I realized and I thought maybe, I should mention that. But it's really difficult in today's world, like, having a conversation for 40 minutes and not let AI come up. Right.
Yeah.
Very nice. Right. But yeah, but like really interesting point that you bring, like, like the given the advancements and everything that's happening, it's very obvious, like you should use it more
Yeah.
and more and learn and do whatever. But and the third question you mentioned, like, obviously reading books is like important. It helps you a lot. So what's your one
Yep.
book recommendation for the audience?
The one book that I've read recently, actually, which has been around for a while, I think,
Mm.
it's called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy.
Mm.
It's a book by Richard Rummelt. Um, it's a really interesting lens into strategic thinking. I think, there's lots of really good content out there about how to build powerful, compelling strategy, but I think this is one of the best books I've read. So that's one that I've
Nice.
read recently that I've really enjoyed, and I would encourage anyone working in product or working in technology to read it.
Nice, awesome. I'll definitely add the link to it in the description for this episode. But Lucas, again, as I said, like it's been like 45 minutes we've been chatting, and it's been like truly wonderful hosting you on the show and such a depth of insights for anybody who is expanding into a new geography and facing any sort of challenges, or they just want to, like, solve any hurdles, especially related to the payments infrastructure, right? Like I think this would be like a very good value add to them. And thank you for sharing all these insights with us.
No worries. Thanks very much for having me. I really enjoyed the chat.